Actually, I ada beli baju baru untuk kita pakai next week. Nanti you bolehlah try.
Oh my god, Selena! Lama tak jumpa.
By the way, this is my girlfriend Justin.
Hi.
This is Hailey, my best friend.
Oh, hi.
Hello. You guys are so cute, but I gotta go. Anything, text me, alright?
Okay.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Kita ni asyik gaduh je. Senang cerita kita break lah. We're done.
Justin!
Dasar sun.
Jadi nak ke mana?
Sekejap lagi lah, I fikir.
Okay, I nak kita nest sekejap tak?
Okay, I tunggu sini je.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello, siapa tu? Hello? Hello, siapa tu? Ada orang tak? Hello? Hello?
Mereput kat dalam ni sun.
Ah! Tolong! Memang tak ada tingkap ni. Aduh!
Ni apa tu? Hello? Hello? Ada orang ke tak?
Tolong! Yeah, tolong! Anyone? Please!
Kak, apa jadi ni?
I don't know, kawan I kurang eye.
Oh my god, tak apa, kita report polis. Tak apa. So the issue is whether the action by Selena is amount to false imprisonment.
False imprisonment requires a deliberate act. The defendant must have meant to confine or restrain the plaintiff. It is not enough if the detention happens accidentally or by mistake. The law looks at whether the defendant's mind was directed towards restricting another person's freedom. Okay, the second will be it must be an active act, not an omission. The second element is that the restraint must come from a positive act. In other words, the defendant must actively do something that causes the confinement. Simply failing to act or neglecting a duty is not enough. For example, if someone forgets to unlock a door, that is an omission and it will not normally amount to false imprisonment. The law requires a clear, active step that results in the restriction. 3. Knowledge of restraint. The third element is that the plaintiff does not need to be aware of the restraint at the time it occurs. Even if the person is asleep, unconscious, or simply unaware that they are being confined, the law still recognizes this as false imprisonment. What matters is the restriction of liberty itself, not whether the person realizes it in the moment. 4. Direct consequence of the defendant's act. The fourth element is that the detention must be a direct result of the defendant's actions. The restraint cannot be too remote or indirect. It must flow immediately from what the defendant did. This ensures that liability is only imposed when the defendant's conduct is the clear cause of the confinement. Number 5. Complete imprisonment. No possible escape. The final element is that the restraint must be total. The plaintiff must be completely confined with no reasonable or safe way to leave. If there is a practical and safe means to escape, then it is not considered false imprisonment. The law is concerned with situations where a person's freedom of movement is fully taken away, leaving them with no genuine choice. Together, these 5 elements form the foundation of false imprisonment.
This principle was confirmed in W.F. Winston and Lee Lang San, 1938, where the court held that intention is a prerequisite for liability in false imprisonment. Second, this was clearly illustrated in Iqbal and Prison Officers Association 2009, where prison officers went on strike and refused to unlock prison cells, preventing the plaintiff from leaving. The court held that this situation amounted to an omission rather than a positive act, and therefore did not constitute false imprisonment. Third, in Herring and Boyle 1834, the court held that a claim for false imprisonment could not succeed unless the plaintiff was aware of the confinement at the time it occurred. However, this position was later rejected in Mering and Graham White Aviation 1919. The plaintiff was detained by a security guard without knowing that he was not free to leave. The court held that awareness is not required. This principle was affirmed in Murray and Ministry of Defence 1988, where the House of Lords confirmed that a person may be falsely imprisoned even while asleep, unconscious, or unaware of the restraint. Fourth, this principle was demonstrated in Hannah and Bond 1925, where the plaintiff remained in a room due to psychological pressure and authority exercised by the defendant. The court held that physical force is not essential and that psychological coercion or intimidation can be sufficient to establish false imprisonment, as long as the plaintiff's liberty is directly restrained by the defendant's conduct. Fifth, in Bird and Jones 1845, the plaintiff was prevented from using a particular pathway but was still free to move in another direction. The court held that this amounted to partial restraint only and therefore did not constitute false imprisonment.
Element 1, intention of the defendant. The first element requires that the defendant intend to detain the plaintiff. So, in this present case, Selena acted deliberately and intentionally. She did not accidentally lock the door. Instead, she waited for Haley to enter the abandoned room and then intentionally lock her inside. Selena's jealousy provides a clear motive and her conduct shows a clear intention to confine Haley. Therefore, Selena possesses the required state of mind to commit false imprisonment. Thus, the first element of intention is satisfied. Second, the element is active act, not mere omission. The second element requires that the imprisonment must result from an active act, not a mere omission. So, in this scenario, Selena commit an active and direct act by locking the door of abandoned room. This was not a failure to act or negligent. Instead, it was a conscious physical action that prevent Haley from leaving. Therefore, Selena's conduct clearly fulfills the requirement of an active act. Hence, the second element is also fulfilled. The third element is knowledge of restraint by the plaintiff. So, in this case, Haley was locked inside the abandoned room and unable to leave. She clearly understood that her liberty was restrained. Even if Haley had been unaware, the tort would still be actionable under modern law. Therefore, knowledge is not an issue. In this case, accordingly, the third element is satisfied. So, the first element, restraint must be the direct result of defendant. The act restraint must be a direct consequence of the defendant's action. So, Haley's confinement was a direct and immediate result of Selena locking the door. There was no intervention by a third party, and no other factor caused the restraint. Haley remained trapped solely because of Selena's intentional act. Thus, the causal link between Selena's action and Haley's detention is clear. Therefore, the fourth element is also satisfied. The fifth element is complete imprisonment, which is a total restraint. So, false imprisonment requires total restraint, not partial obstruction. So, in this present case, Haley was locked inside an abandoned room with no reasonable or safe means of escape. She could not leave without Selena unlocking the door. Any attempt to escape could expose Haley to physical danger, especially given that the room was abandoned. Therefore, Haley was under complete restraint, not partial obstruction. Hence, the fifth element is satisfied.
Upon this case, first intention of defendant, based on the case W. Alfinston and Lee Leng Sign, the court held intention to detain in essential element for false imprisonment. In this situation, Selena clearly acted with intention. She did not accidentally lock Haley inside the room. Instead, she deliberately waited until Haley entered the abandoned room and then locked the door. Her jealousy towards Haley shows a clear motive behind her action. Therefore, following the case W. Alfinston and Lee Leng Sign, Selena had the necessary intention to restrain Haley's freedom of movement.
The second element is active act by the defendant. In the case of Iqbal Prison Officers Association, the court emphasized that false imprisonment must be caused by an active act and not a mere omission. Here, Selena carried out a positive act by physically locking the door. This action directly prevented Haley from leaving the room. Since Selena's conduct involved a clear and deliberate act, this element is satisfied according to the case of Iqbal and Prison Officers Association. Third element is knowledge of restraint by the plaintiff. In the case of Nearing and Graham White Aviation, the court decided that a person can be falsely imprisoned even without knowing it. This principle was later confirmed in the case of Murray and Ministry of Defence. Applying these cases, Haley was fully aware that she was trapped inside the room and could not leave. Even if she had been unaware, false imprisonment would still be established. Therefore, based on the case of Nearing and Murray, the requirement regarding knowledge of restraint is clearly fulfilled. So the fourth element is restraint as a direct result of the defendant's act. In the case of Hane and Bond, the court held that restraint caused directly by defendant's actions, including psychological restraint, is sufficient to establish false imprisonment. In this case, Haley's detention happened solely because Selena locked the door. There was no third party involved and no other factor causing the restraint. Haley remained confined as a direct result of Selena's action. Thus, following case Hane and Bone, this element is satisfied. So the last element is complete imprisonment. In the case of Bird and Jones, the court held the false imprisonment requires total restraint and not just partial obstruction. Additionally, in the case of Wright and Wilson, states that any escape must be reasonable and safe. Applying these cases, Haley was locked inside an abandoned room with no reasonable or safe way to escape. She could not leave unless Selena unlocked the door, and attempting to escape could expose her to danger. Unlike in the case of Bird and Jones, this is case of total restraint. Therefore, this element is fulfilled.
To conclude, Selena has fulfilled 5 elements of false imprisonment. Therefore, Haley may take actions against Selena.